It's wonderful to see everybody today. I'm Rabbi Schenkman, for those who I might not yet have had the pleasure to meet. And I'm so thrilled and excited to be with you all today for this Empty Nesters book discussion on The Last Green Valley. Also am delighted to welcome back our speaker today, Mark Sullivan. We are so thrilled that Mark is here with us again. We had the pleasure of having him last year, and this year we have on this book on The Last Green Valley, and we are able to do that in thanks and partnership with the Jewish Book Council. So I encourage you. I'm going to, even though you've met Mark before, we've had him with the Empty Nesters before, I'm going to invite you to learn a little bit again, and I am going to put in the chat a link to his book. This link is through our WHC Mitzvah Mall, and so it allows you to not only support Mark and purchase his book, but also in addition to be able to support some of the work that we do at Washington Hebrew in supporting others. And that goes towards not just Mitzvah Day, but other efforts on behalf of the congregation. And I'm also giving you, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Mark, but there is a lot of information that you can find. And we're just so delighted to have this opportunity to be with him again, to have him join us. Mark Sullivan is the author of 18 novels, or is it now 19?
19. Yeah.
19. Yeah. Who's counting? 19 and one on the way, including the #1 best-selling Beneath a Scarlet Sky, which we had Mark come and speak with us last year. And that book has been published in 37 languages, but probably more at this point. I don't know how many The Last Green Valley has been published in, but I'm sure Mark will be able to tell us that. Yeah. And Beneath the Scarlet Sky also is being made into a limited series starring Tom Holland. Mark has also worked extensively with James Patterson, with whom he wrote 5 #1 New York Times bestsellers in the Private series. Before turning to fiction, he worked as an investigative journalist. Mark lives in Southwest Montana, where he remains grateful for the miracle of every moment. However, today he, he is in Los Angeles, getting ready to travel to Fiji to celebrate his wife's retirement, which is very exciting. So, Mark, we are so thrilled to have this opportunity to have you back with us, and we'll look forward to hearing later on about the next opportunity we hopefully will have. But we're delighted to have you with us, to have you tell us about The Last Green Valley, how it came about. And then I want to encourage people, if you have questions you'd like me to ask of Mark later, you can send them to me directly in the chat, and we'll try to address those during our time together. So Mark, thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Rabbi Schenkman. This is an honor to be here again. And this time to talk about The Last Green Valley. You know, after the publication of Beneath the Scarlet Sky, you know, immediately people were saying, oh, you'll never find another story like that again. And I kept saying, oh, I don't know, I think I will. I don't think what I went through to get Beneath was going to be a one-shot deal. And sure enough, all these, you know, ideas started coming out of the woodwork. I started getting emails and letters to my website, and you know, people talking about various untold stories that they knew of. And I figured out very quickly I was going to need some kind of criteria. What exactly was I looking for? And I went back and thought a lot about Beneath, and it came to me that the book and the story was inherently moving, inspiring. It was healing for some people and transformative for others. And so I wrote those 4 words down. This is what I'm looking for. And I went about it like believing wholeheartedly it was going to come to me. And, you know, I had a bunch that were close, but they weren't hitting me in all 4 levels until I was giving a talk about Beneath the Scarlet Sky before the Noontime Rotary in Bozeman, Montana, where I live. And a guy who was a retired dentist comes up afterwards and says, "Do you know these people in town, the Martels?" And I said, "You mean the construction people?" I said, I know who they are, but I don't know them. And he said, "Well, the entire time I was reading Beneath, all I could think of was the story of how they came to America. You need to hear it." So a couple days later, I type in Bill Martel's address, and it's like 2 miles from my house, right? And then I'm going along, and it tells me to take a left into this older neighborhood, and I start getting this strange feeling, and I can't quite figure it out until I get to Bill Martel's driveway. And I realize I can't be 200, 250 yards from the dinner party where I heard Beneath the Scarlet Sky. Same neighborhood, you know. As an aside, my agent tells me to go knock on every door in that neighborhood because you've got a career there, right? But I went in, I met Bill, and he starts telling me the story. And within like 10 minutes, I'm sitting forward in my chair, listening intently. And within an hour, I know I'm doing it because it's hitting me at all four levels, right? It's first of all, it's one of the most extraordinary stories of a run for freedom that I've ever heard. It's morally complicated. It forces the reader to ask all sorts of questions, and most of which are, what would I have done in the same situation? And so I told Bill I was going to write it, and we worked out a thing where I could work with him and his brother, Walter. And I ended up going and retracing the route. I started at the border of Moldova, the first trip, and went all the way through Romania, Hungary, up through Czech Republic and into Poland. And that was remarkable because I was lucky that I had a guide who was able to introduce me to people who had witnessed this exodus of ethnic German Ukrainians who were running from the Russians. Sound familiar? And at the same time, they're being protected by the SS, and they don't know why. And I was forced to dig a lot into this history of it, and there is quite a bit of history about it in Germany. I was able to go through the archives, and it turns out the reason, unbeknownst to them at the time, the reason they were being saved was that Heinrich Himmler, who was the architect of the final solution, believed that these ethnic Germans who had lived in the in Ukraine for well over 150 years at this point, they lived in these small colonies, and Himmler believed that they were the last pure Aryan blood on earth, and he wanted them protected. And I had no idea about this, and they had no idea until I found it. And I met this guy along the way. He was one of the first people I met who was one of these witnesses. And he was like 98 when I met him. And he was one of the last survivors of Stalingrad. And he was a fascinating guy in that he had not only survived Stalingrad, but he ended up being a POW, very much like Emil Martel was, in these labor camps that the Soviets set up after the war to try to repair what had been damaged. And he survived, he escaped from 2 or 3 of these camps, and he survived by believing 100% that he was destined to become a beekeeper. And he was one of the most spiritual people I've ever met. It turns out he was a Romanian national hero. On his 100th birthday, he was, given the equivalent of the Congressional Medal of Honor in Romania. He's still alive. He outlived 3 wives. He's 102 now and going strong, from what I understand. But anyway, I had him in the back of my mind when I went with Walter and Bill to Ukraine, and we were able to actually find the ruins of their farmhouse. And we went there, and to be there with Walter and Bill when they saw the entire arc of their improbable life was emotionally overwhelming for them and for me, because I could see it, right? I could see what they had gone through, even though they were young boys, and how far they'd come in their life was extraordinary. That was up a road that was about 7 hours long, one of the worst roads I've been on. And that's saying something, because I've been on some nasty ones. And we wanted to go to this place, Poltava, where Mr. Martel had been held as a prisoner, but it was 13 hours up a road that was supposedly worse than that one. So I knew I couldn't put him through it because Walter was like 82 and Bill was 80. And so I chartered a plane and I flew us up there. And I got a guide to bring us, and we went to the museum, and it's there. It's been totally restored. And for those of you who haven't read the book, the museum is where Mr. Martel was held in the prison camp. That's where he slept, along with 500 to 700 of the 2,500 who were there, and they're dying all around him. So we go to the museum, and it's closed for renovations, and we're like, oh no. And we wandered around, and we knocked on a bunch of doors, and we finally get to talk to the director, and he's very suspicious. I mean, here are these American guys. We're only in town for 4 hours, and we're here to look at this. And he was highly suspicious of us until Walter, who's kind of a gregarious guy, starts telling stories about his dad, what they knew about it. And very quickly, he mentions the fact that Emil used to gather firewood at the hospital construction site and sell it to the cooks at the prisoner camp. And the director got this big grin. He said, my mom was one of the cooks. And then we were in, and he took us in, and he took us to the basement where Emil had lived. And if I thought the emotion was thick when we found the ruins of their site, to actually be with them when they were in the actual room that their father survived while men were dying all around him, it was simply extraordinary, and a moment that I'll never forget as long as I live. And we were getting ready to leave. Walter and I were going to fly to Germany to retrace their final escape route out of Soviet-occupied Germany. And I was having a discussion with Bill, and I said, it's my impression, everything that I've heard about your dad. I was lucky that I had a couple of 90-minute interviews with Emil and Adeline on tape that I could listen to. And I was able to talk to all their grandkids and kids, of course. But it dawned on me, and I said this to them, that your dad goes from being this guy who survives Stalinism by not getting noticed, right? No ambition. Don't try to be anything, because any kind of ambition, any kind of excellence will get you sent to the gulag under Stalin. And yet, and he goes into the camp, even though he has these moments on the initial part of the trip. When he goes into the camp, he's still pretty much that guy, right? He's thinking, this is how my father survived the gulag. You shut up, you do your work, you try to get out. And something happens to him in there, right? He comes out, and I won't say he's James Bond, but he starts taking all these crazy risks that he never would have taken earlier in his life. And I asked Bill and Walter about that, and they said it's 100% true. And I can't really point to one thing that explains it, because he didn't like to talk about it. He was just, what he liked to say is he'd worked at the hospital, lived in the museum, and worked on the death detail because he could get more food. And they also planned to escape that way. They thought that the pony would get them out. And he said, but I think that he must have met somebody in there who had a profound influence on his life. And he said, but you're just going to have to invent it because we don't know. And I said, well, I got just the guy in The Beekeeper. And that turned out to be one of the more magical parts of the book. It was surprising to me. It took off in a way that I didn't expect. And yet it explained the entire experience that he went through, and certainly the person he became. And when I wrote it, Bill and Walter were just thrilled. They were like, I don't know if that's the way it happened, but it sure explains it. And so I was very happy about that. And then Walter and I did go to Germany. We went to Poland, to Lodz, which turns out was the Ellis Island of the Third Reich. I had no idea before I learned all this and how it worked. And then we were able to retrace their final escape route, which looks like it did back then. For about 40 or 50 years, it was heavily fortified. It was part of the Berlin Wall. And now it's been all been torn down. There's a place where there's a little demonstration where you can go and see what it looked like during the East-West Germany divide under communism. But they basically restored it, so it looks just like it, the fields and the little lane that they took. And we actually found the woodshed that they hid in. It was still standing there, right? It was decrepit. It was all, but it was there. I mean, he goes, "That's it, right there. We stood right there." And to be with him and take that walk, where she ran, but we took all the walk all the way across, and it brought the whole thing alive for me. And I went back and I wrote in a white heat for close to a year to get it all down. And it's funny because of all the books I've ever written, that one took the least revision because it was so vivid in my mind, and from what they had said, and being able to listen to Bill and Walter, and then their parents describing what had happened. One of the interesting things about it was I had to learn a lot about ethnic Germans and their role in the Holocaust because they had some. And at first I was very troubled because one of the things that a granddaughter told me was that after Emil passed, Adeline explained that when they went back to Friedenstal, their little town that they had been thrown out of under Stalinism, the Germans gave them back their land. And so they went back and they were rebuilding their house, and Emil needed roofing supplies to be able to build the roof. And he went to the closest town, and he was supposed to be gone like a day and a half, and he was gone 4.5 days. And when he came back, Adeline said he was as shaken, rattled as she'd ever seen him. And she asked what had happened, and he said he'd been held by the Nazis and he'd been forced to bury Jews. So I had read that there were some ethnic Germans who willingly participated in the Holocaust and then later claimed that they had only buried Jews. So I had, a hurdle to go over. I went to Yad Vashem, people that I know at Yad Vashem, and I was at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial. There's like absolutely zero evidence that the Martels were involved in anything other than what they said. But I had to face it, right? I mean, I found that the best drama, the best writing comes out of the stuff that scares you. And so I had to really think a lot about, okay, what was it like? What did he have to go through? And very quickly I found research that indicated that this travesty that he had witnessed took place in a place called Dubasari, which is right on the border of Moldova, about 18 kilometers from Friedenstal. So right there, right? I mean, this is where he would have gone. And it turned out there were between 9,000 and 10,000 Jews shot to death in early September of 1943, which is when he goes to the town. So I also learned that just prior to the invasion of Russia, the Soviet Union, by Hitler, that Heinrich Himmler had planned the final solution, and he saw it as a Holocaust of bullets. Right, that this was all going to be done with guns, and he wanted to see how it would work. So he asked to witness a firing squad of political prisoners. And when he saw it, by all accounts, Himmler got violently ill and declared that no one will be punished for refusing to shoot a Jew. I want true believers behind the guns. And that was true. It turned out that at the Nuremberg trials, a number of SS guys at the beginning tried to claim that they had no choice, that they would have been shot if they didn't participate. And yet, when the defense councils went around to the various prisons that the SS were being held in, they asked pointedly for examples of situations in which people were killed for refusing to kill Jews, and they couldn't find any. And that's remarkable because it would have been a big defense, and they never found any of them. And I found that utterly fascinating, and it helped me create this scenario where Emil Martel is told to shoot Jews. And for those of you who haven't read it, you should, because it's one of the better moral quandaries I've ever encountered. And it really, really helped the book in a big way. Yeah, so that's that's pretty much the story of how I did it and how I wrote it and why I was so fascinated with it. But people have asked me, so what was the big transformation for you to read this book? And well, first of all, it was this issue of the beekeeper. It was this incredible moral quandary that Emil Martel is put in. And afterwards, he comes to believe a certain thing about himself, which haunts him for a big part of the book until the beekeeper reframes it and has him see it in a different way. But for me, the remarkable thing was understanding just how incredible people are who are immigrants who are trying to come to this country, that what they go through to try to get to freedom is something that the vast majority of Americans have no clue. We just take it for granted. And to encounter people who lived under communism and chaos, and they fight for years to get the freedom. And when they do, the whole world opens wide for them. And I was just completely blown away by that aspect of the story, and I still am.
Thank you so much. This amazing quest, or quests in a sense, because they're searching for this Green Valley, and they're escaping from horrible, sort of the parallels. I know you wrote this before current events unfolding right there, and you can imagine. I can only a little bit just from reading this book, but the terror and the terrain and all of that you painted so beautifully on the pages of the book. But there's this destination that Adeline has, this Green Valley. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that, because I know that's something that certainly we talk about in Judaism, is the need to always maintain a sense of faith and hope. And amazing in even one of the earliest scenes in the book, when they're in the middle of a battle. I mean, they are literally, and they're still the amount that they endured and overcame. It has to be fiction, yet we know that it's not. So could you speak a little bit to the Green Valley?
Sure. So there was an event in Ukraine in the early 30s called the Holodomor. And it means the horror. And it was when Joseph Stalin starved 4 million Ukrainians to death, trying to stamp out Ukrainian nationalism, which is exactly what Putin's doing, right? He's trying to stamp out Ukrainian nationalism. So this is a recurring theme, obviously, in that part of the world. When Mrs. Martel, when she survived the Holodomor, she got a job. She had worked outside and got very ill, and finally gets this job working for a Jewish widow as her maid and cook. And the woman had a folio of paintings, like a turn page paintings. And Adeline sees this painting of, we have to believe it's probably Germany, but it's perfect valley with snow-capped mountains around it and a green floor and a river running through it. And she gets asked very early in the book, like any young family, right? Everybody's taking the road trip with the young kids, and one of the first things is, where are we going? When are we going to get there? And that question becomes, the touchstone of the whole thing, because she starts describing the painting, and they all get this image in their minds. And what's thoroughly remarkable is it's the thing they cling to, right? It's not only a faith in God, it's a faith in a dream that they're going to get freedom and that they're going to end up in paradise, right? Their version. What I found stunning was that they cling to this all the way, and they get a chance to come to Montana. Of course, they get to Baker, Montana, in a snowstorm in September. And Mr. Martel looks out the window and he's like, we're in Siberia. I've blown it. This is no Green Valley, and but all these things start to intercede, right? His cousin's son 4Fs out of the military, and he has to come home. And Mr. Martel is forced to go look for work. And he goes into Baker, and it turns out they're building a hospital, the first one, a medical clinic. And he goes and asks for a job. And the guy says, well, the only job I have is making cement, and it's really cold. And he goes, I can do that. I did it in the Soviet prison camp that I escaped from. The guy looks at him and goes, you escaped from a Soviet prison camp? Yes, sir. And he goes, you've got a job. And away he goes. And within 5 years of them coming to Montana, Walter graduates as the valedictorian of his class. I mean, he learns English as a second language and then goes on to win. And, you know, he applies to 2 places. He wants to be an architect. He applies to the University of Chicago to study under Frank Lloyd Wright, and he applies to Montana State College, which is what it was called at that time. And they go, because they vowed never to be apart, and they go to Chicago, and it's not for them. And then they drive to Bozeman, and, you know, they get lost, and they come out on a ridge, which is like very near my house, and they see the valley. And the whole thing comes full circle for them. And remarkably, as I describe in the book, from that moment forward, everything that the Martels touched turned to gold. Just incredible, right? So improbable, almost not to be believed, and yet it's all there, you know?
Amazing. I mean, it's the American dream,
Yes.
literally. And you live there, which is also must be, you know, it wasn't something you had to dream up or imagine,
No.
but to know that, you know, as you're telling the story, that their destination is the place that has become your
Yes.
Green Valley as well.
Yeah. Yeah. People ask me, what's my Green Valley? And I mean, obviously the Gallatin Valley is my valley, but it's really telling these kinds of stories, right? It's, as a young wannabe writer, I had dreams of telling stories that would have impact, right? And I spent a good part of my career being an entertainer, and I love every single book I wrote. But there was something missing, and it wasn't until I started telling these kinds of stories that my purpose for being really kind of came into sharp focus.
Which is a great segue to a question that Jim and Mary Solander, I don't know which one, posted in the chat, which is to please comment on the relationship of this story and Viktor Frankl's logotherapy, strength through finding a purpose.
Yes. Well, first of all, he's one of my heroes, Viktor Frankl. So I saw definite parallels between this story and his philosophy, because it certainly became, if not stated, understated about the Martels and who they were and what they were going to become. You know, one of the more interesting things to me was when the beekeeper analyzes Martel's name, and he says, "Well, you're not a farmer. You're a hammer. You know, you build things," and it's that moment where he starts to shift. He becomes no longer a cultivator, but a builder. And that's his purpose in life. But I do truly believe that once you find your purpose in life, life changes, right? Because you know that you're not wasting time. You're doing something for a real purpose. And it's been my blessing that this has happened to me in my life.
It's been our blessing too,
yeah.
That you've found this purpose. I want to come back to the beekeeper, because he's a magical character in the book. You know, it's sort of this talk about holding on to faith and hope and living dreams and pursuing those dreams, which can give purpose, especially in a time and moment. And he's alone in the world. And the way, can you talk about bringing him back in the story? I mean, he sort of appears at one point and provides this magical account that sort of transforms the way Adeline and Emil and the family approach everything. And then to have him come back at the moment when Emil most needs that type of a character.
Yeah. it turns out that the real beekeeper, Georgy Vasilescu, actually did survive Stalingrad. He was hit by a mortar bomb. He did awaken from that, believing that he would survive and he would not be touched. And he did walk through the battle, burying Romanian soldiers as he went. He gets back after Stalingrad, and he is a witness right there, right in that general area where I described of the caravans coming through. He did remember it. He did remember talking to them. So given who he was in the story, I had no problem introducing him there, right? He just comes out and he's got stolen honey wine, and he's getting a little drunk, and he's telling the stories. And the fact is that he was sent to 4 different prison camps and escaped 3 of them. And so it was easy for me to see him being there in the prison camp with Emil, because he was in one right around there. And then he ends up being sent to this one in Crimea, where he spends 4 years and survives the whole ordeal by believing 100% he's going to become a beekeeper. And it seems like such a small thing, but I think that was the beauty of it, is that it doesn't matter what the dream is, as long as it's meaningful to you. And it gives your life purpose. And certainly becoming a beekeeper was Mr. Vasilescu's reason for being. He told me there's no doubt in his mind that he outlived 3 wives because he ate royal jelly and got stung all the time, and still believes that, and I was able to see the beauty in that, that it was so simple that it was illustrative, and yet it wasn't cartoonish. He just kind of appeared fully formed. It helped that I had understood the real person and got to meet him. But in the book, he's really the moral center, and he's the one who holds it all together and makes you realize that sometimes the meaning you give to events in life is not the meaning. It's the wrong meaning, right? You have a choice on how to define it. And Emil had always defined things wrong until he was shown a different way to look at life. And I think that that's true of most people in life. We all know people who have events that crush them and they never recover. Or there are events like Viktor Frankl describes that would crush the ordinary person, but because they give new meaning to the event, it transforms them, right? They're no longer crushed by it. They're actually strengthened by it. They become a better person for it, and they can look at life in a different way.
He has this mystical aspect to him as well, almost like in Jewish tradition, Elijah the prophet, who shows up in stories and shows up in places where people need that, whatever that message is, and it's a beautiful aspect to it. So somebody asked Jim and Mary again, are you familiar with the refugee story in The Beekeeper of Aleppo?
I am not. I've read a bunch about Aleppo, but I'm not familiar with that story. Okay. I'm going to, though.
Now you are.
I read a great book about a library that was kept alive in Aleppo during the bombardment. I just finished it and blurbed it. It was very good.
Wow.
Yeah.
Another question from Lisa Esserman. When the ethnic Germans who were protected by the Nazis were given orders to shoot Jews, they must have been terrified not to follow orders. Were they aware of Himmler's decree that they were allowed to refuse and could be delegated to burial duty?
No, it's not my understanding that they were aware. And certainly, in the story, Emil is not aware of it. Emil makes the right decision, and then he makes the wrong decision, but is rescued from following through on it, right? Because of his ask. He asks God not to have to do this, and he doesn't eventually. But in his mind, he had made the decision to do it, And in his mind, that was enough, right? He had crossed a line where he never would have considered it before, but he does cross the line mentally, but does not have to take the moment physically. And again, I think it's one of those situations where when you realize that he refused, right? His initial response is, I can't do this. I won't do this. And he has no idea what the repercussions are going to be when he does that. And then with the gun in his face, he changes his mind, but then is stopped before he has to shoot. So Heinrich Himmler's order was not explained to people, but it was definitely there.
And
am I allowed to say something? I'm sorry. I thought it was so interesting that you said that that people didn't murder the Jews when they were ordered to.
Some didn't. That's correct. And if you look at the ethnic Germans, there's a place called Bognakovo, which is south of, it's on the Bug River, and I refer to it, it's where the character Nicholas comes from. In that concentration camp, there were like 50,000 plus Jews shot over the course of about 19 days. And I knew all about that. And so I wanted to present both sides of the story, right? That there were definitely ethnic Germans in Ukraine who willingly participated, but there were also ethnic Germans in Ukraine who saved Jews and died for it. They did. And so I wanted to present both sides of the situation as clearly as I could, and yet make it, all of it, in a morally gray area. You know, I wanted readers to struggle with it. Who would you have been? Would you have been Nicholas, or would you have been Emil Martel?
Yeah, I was struggling. You achieved that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for that question. Also, the fact that that Nicholas and Major Haussmann are constant. I mean, they keep popping up, is also, you know, sort of this idea, apologies for the dog, but that our conscience, you know, things come up when we least expect it. We think we've dealt with something, we've come to terms with something, and then something reminds us. And how do you live with that? I mean, not just the sense of living with faith and hope, but how do you live with yourself when you have these types of struggles as well? Right.
You know, and Haussmann was a very real person. He was part of one of the Einsatzgruppen who was at Dubasari. And later, extraordinarily, these same murderers were assigned to protect the ethnic Germans. Now, I have no direct evidence that Haussmann and Emil ever met, but they were certainly in close proximity to each other multiple times during the course of the story, at Dubasari and then again on the trek. So I had no qualms putting them in direct opposition to each other. And Haussmann did actually commit suicide before he could be tried at Nuremberg.
It really, again, is an incredible story that reads like fiction, but is, you know, is a reality. And to be seeing similar stories playing out right now, but playing out when there are different kinds of terrors in our, you know, modern world, that you know, even with how terrifying all of that was for the Martel family and the extended family. I mean, this is, you know, the realities of war. And you know, I just was reminded of, you know, what we see happening in Ukraine and across Ukraine and Poland and certainly Russia as well, with families being torn apart and making those difficult choices. And you know, and for some of the Martel family going back, you know, it just is, it's heartbreaking to imagine what families are experiencing now, and you know, the challenge of getting to someplace safe.
Yeah, I mean, some of the early images of the first refugees, they were pushing carts. I just saw them, and it could have been all you had to do is change the clothes, and you got the same effect going on right now. People have asked me, did you expect an invasion? I went, no, I don't think anybody expected it. But once you understood that Russian leaders have coveted the Soviet Union since Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and on and on and on. This has happened about 5 times, in the course of Russian-Ukrainian history. Just as Catherine the Great understood that Ukraine is one of the great breadbaskets of the world, so did Hitler, so did Stalin, and so does Putin. I think he's doing it more for his ability to get gas and oil to the Black Sea and then around the world than anything. But he's also doing it because there is a real strategic benefit to being able to eat. And that's why they're going after it.
Yep.
Yeah.
So you've shared that it is there are 4 things you talked about earlier: that transformative, healing, inspirational. I'm forgetting the 4th, but you'll tell us.
Moving first.
Moving.
Yeah.
So finding those stories finding you, and this is incredible that this story found you literally where you live.
Yes.
And I know that you are working on something now. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what we'll hope to bring you back to talk about the next time.
Sure. So again, after I wrote Last Green Valley, we were like, oh, you got lucky, you got 2, but you'll never find a 3rd. And I had a bunch of them that were close again, and that still may be written. I just don't know. But about 2 years ago now, we had a very close friend of our family's die. His name was Alan Hayes, and Alan, among other things, raised 28 teenage boys who are all trying to make the U.S. ski team, including both my sons. They lived with him in Salt Lake when they were training at Park City to try to make the U.S. ski team in the Olympics. And Alan, fascinating guy, he invented the computer mouse, among other things. And when he died, it was a shock to all of us. He had back surgery and then got a clot, and he had a stroke and died. So my sons, because he was like their second dad, packed up their stuff and went straight to Salt Lake. It turned out that Connor, my oldest son, who's also a novelist, was one of the executors of the will. And when he got down at the estate, when he got down there, there was another guy who came in who had been one of Alan's boys about 20 years before Connor. And at that point, he was the commander of SEAL Team 6. He'd gone to the Naval Academy, became a SEAL, and then became the commander for all of Africa. And, they were there dealing with Alan's affairs. And of course, they were telling Alan stories and having a few beers. And Eric tells Connor this story that he'd heard. True story. And Connor called me up the next day and said, Dad, I think I found your next book. He said, it's one of those great stories of humanity. What can somebody overcome and survive? I said, well, what's it about? And he said, no, you got to hear this from Eric and Mick. And Mick, it turns out, was at that point the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense under General Mattis in the Trump administration. And he had been a former CIA field operative and also the chief of office in Kampala, Uganda. He was the head CIA guy. And that's where he heard the story, in Uganda. And they tell me the story and I'm like, come on. And they're like, no, it's true. They're still alive and you need to go hear it. Well, I wanted to go hear it in June of 20, but that got thrown out the window. So we got lucky and got a window of opportunity last June. And we went for 3 weeks, me and the SEAL team commander and the CIA guy. And I hear the story of 2 14-year-olds, a boy and a girl who get kidnapped by this messianic warlord when they're 14, and along with 25,000 other children. and they get put through some of the most brutal combat training these guys had ever heard of, and they survive it, and they're in battle for like 10 years, but halfway during it, they meet each other and they legitimately fall in love. And the power of love saves them, allows them to escape eventually, and then motivates them to get on shortwave radios and begin calling the other children out of the bush. I never heard a story like it. And it's another one of these stories of the triumph of the human spirit. And those are the stories that I'm telling.
Mark, thank you. That was going to be our last question. There are two. I've gotten a couple questions in the chat. So one,
Sure.
which I think speaks to what you're talking about. Did Walter and Bill have any idea of where their mother got her strength?
That's a great question. That is a great question, because they talked about it all the time, how strong she was mentally. And they believed she got it from her faith. She had this unwavering faith that they would find their way to the Green Valley and that they would survive. But there are certain moments, right? There are two moments that stick out in my mind for her utter courage. The first one is when she walks away from her mother and her sister. To me, that's one of the most defining moments of her, is that Emil has told her to go as far west as she can and he'll find her. And she believes him. She believes him to the point where she literally looks at her mother and sister and she knows that she'll never see him again. And she still does it, which is just phenomenal. And then the other one is when they're hiding in the fire shed, right? The firewood shed. And she makes a decision to go. Right when she's seen other prisoners brought right by her, and she still makes this extraordinary decision to go. And that's a question. Would I have had the guts to walk away from my mother and sister? Would I have had the mental and spiritual fortitude to look at the Soviets going that way and to run this way, right at the border? I think it's one of those things that makes you constantly ask yourself, what would I have done? Would I have been that kind of person? Would freedom have meant that much to me? I don't know.
Great questions. Then the other question is, can you comment on Houseman's intervention to help save Emil's sister?
Sure.
When there's that horrible train accident, and he callously killed Jews, and yet here he intervenes.
Right. Someone did intervene. A Nazi soldier did intervene and help save her. Okay, so in the book, it's Houseman, and it's because the more I read about monsters, there's always an aspect of their personality that's, I don't think it's redeemifying, or if that's even a word. It doesn't redeem them, but it certainly shows you that people have all sorts of aspects to their personality, and that even someone who's a murderer can be altruistic in the right situation. And I think that's fascinating, right? That people will make moves that would seem, if you didn't know anything else about them, you go, oh, a good person, right? Somebody who's made this effort. And yet I think that that's more human. I don't think people are black and white. I really don't. And it's so rare to meet someone who's black and white. In my earlier iteration as a writer, as an investigative reporter, I've interviewed stone cold serial killers, and they love their mother. They love dogs. I mean, there was always this aspect about them where you were kind of going, this is a complete disconnect, but it was always there.
Well, thank you again for delving into that and all of these questions, but also for leading us to this wonderful Green Valley, to this beautiful story. And I think the one the sad part is that the Martels didn't get to read the book.
No.
But that you've honored their memories and all that they did on their journey, and And you're living out their dream as well in your own way. And we just are looking forward to continuing to read your beautiful words. And we wish you and your wife a wonderful, well-deserved trip to Fiji.
Thank you.
And hope that that you find your green valley there as well. And we look forward to continuing to read your words and share in the future.